Pretty much here, we've been, like I say, burnt timber 23. I drove onto that site and you would have saw a rock face there, and I said, well, what are you guys doing for reclamation? And they didn't know what to say. So pretty much we've been working at trying to incorporate interim reclamation into some of these older sites that were basically, you might say the previous officer wasn't a real proponent of interim reclamation. So it's coming, you know what I mean? We've done some sites up limestone and basically using the same techniques when we go to final reclamation. So the object of the interim reclamation, if you do it, whatever we're saying, if you do some interim reclamation, then you won't have to do the full reclamation at the end of the day. If you do the contouring and some of the roll back rough and lumpy and get the vegetation growing on some of those sites you're no longer using, then you just have to come back and deal with you might say the teardrop or the pad. So the benefit for the company is there's a kind of a trade-off. You do some of the interim reclamation and get those sites growing trees and species now. 30 years later, then we just got to come back and deal with a smaller circular and a smaller footprint on a landscape. Pretty much what's happening with oil and gas is sites are growing, and if we can allow, there isn't a problem with the site growing, we just got to get the interim reclamation started so that then the site shrinks when we're done with the main drilling and the main thing. Once you're in production, you can start to shrink the site accordingly. So, like I say, pretty much this is pretty typical of what we're trying to push in conjunction. This one just happens to be in conjunction as a more or less we were able to create a multi-use trail in conjunction with the reclamation of this particular site. So you probably, like I say, when you see the site itself, they hauled in a bunch of woody debris into this site because there's active logging not too far away. So it, like I say, my push of going to rough and lumpy has, and some rollback shell has been more than accommodating to go find some woody debris and haul it in, and you'll see that it does make a difference. I mean, if you can create some microsites here, if you were to plant this particular site without that kind of stuff, basically the trees are hard pressed to survive because they dry up, you know what I mean? So both this one and burnt timber 15 was basically the object of trying to create microsites so that then we could get something to grow on top, to grow there. In this particular case, they came back and planted some seedlings, and now you're starting to see them start to take off. So
we've been able to work with the FMA holder here, West Fraser. Traditionally, they didn't want to plant our sites because we had those nice little golf course sites, all contoured and beautiful work by a hoe operator. But Mark Kimmel, who did burnt timber 15, he got the silviculturists to come out and teach us how to plant it, or to build the microsites, and then for successful planting. And part of it, I think, Mark, you can probably talk to it more, is, you know, making the divot and then planting for the wet year, the interim year, and the dry year. So they're more than happy to order our trees for us, and they're doing the planting. Traditionally, they wouldn't work with us. Now that we're following their protocol, they're working with us, and I think it's a benefit to the FMA holders too, because every acre that they plant goes into the harvestable timber, and most oil and gas sites never get back into the acreage for the forestry people. So, you know, it's been a good learning, and they're working with us. I think if we walk up to the top of the hill, we can see down onto the whole lease. So on this one we had, it was about a 30-meter cut and fill, traditional cheap build for a lease site. And then we hauled out close to 20,000 cubic meters. We treated some of it. It was an invert drilling sump. This well never produced, so it was all the result of just the drilling sump. So we had to really scrounge some material when we put it back. We took it out of the fills, or the fills where we removed our culverts and stuff, put it up there, and we hauled in about 95 loads of slash. You need lots of it, but so we're pretty good.
Actually, during the discussion of this original site, this has actually gone beyond what I was looking for. So, because of there was basically we were just going to deal with the back slope on the site wasn't bad. It was probably, other than the fact that it didn't have a lot of vegetation on it, it was probably acceptable at the time, and I was basically going to concentrate on the, you might say, the level area, whichever. When I came back and it was like this was, like I say, above and beyond my expectation. And
Well, part of it was
exactly
backfilling the hole, Kevin.
What's that? This is great, because the object is that when you come to these things, everybody has a different vision of what the end result is going to be, and whichever. I guess the object here is to try to get to the principles of the reclamation, because the object is to get A, stuff contoured, B, the soils managed properly, and then some kind of vegetation back on the site. So pretty much this should do that task accordingly. And at the end of the day, probably in 5 years, you probably won't even know that well site was there, because it'll match in with the dog rib burn. So, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, you probably won't even know that there was a well site there at any time.
Kevin,
Yeah.
I think Carol mentioned this one's got a Rexer, correct?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
Okay.
Burnt Timber 15 is the one with the Rexer.
This year in August.
Okay.
We're able to.
Okay. So the other one.
This one should be able to meet it in a very quick period of time, you know what I mean? Given what they've done and whichever, this site should probably, in less than 5 years, should be able to get a Rexer without a big amount of issues, you know what I mean? You also come to some of these that'll have rock faces built into them. The goal is that we'll just match that. In some cases we can't get everything all back to the top or back to original. Then we'll just, if it's got some rock faces, then we just blend that in accordingly, because there's, you look around the landscape, they're all over the place kind of thing when you come to this corner of the world. So pretty much you don't have to put, my opinion is you don't have to put everything back. The object, if you put it back, it's got to stay there, right? Lots of guys will tell me they can put it to the top of the mountain, but it may not stay there, you know what I mean? And the position that I take is if you put it back, it better stay there, because if not, then let's look at the overall plan and readjust accordingly from that context. Because I have no problem with leaving some open face, rock open face, or some rocky type areas to it, because it blends into the rest of the landscape and it's already there.
We've had a couple this year up in the limestone, which was too far to drive to. It's kind of my favorite, where we had 40 years of natural regrowth, and we were able to transplant all of that. And I think it's going to take less than 5 years if the transplant is successful.
Yeah, the one she talks about was an old road that basically wound back into a real rocky site, and basically we left most of the site as we transplanted the advanced growth where we thought it would best grow, and we used the strippings with it, and the rest of it basically is probably going to end up with as a rocky open face when you look at the rock. And the road coming out, we didn't do a lot of major reconstruction of the road, because the ditches were probably full of regen, you know what I mean? They were solid 25-foot regen, so we basically just dealt with the road surface, making sure that it drained. They roughed it up and then loosened it up so that we could then plant it with some seedlings. And then some of the culverts, we would have done way more damage trying to pull that culvert out than leaving the culvert in whichever. The culvert was basically, in most cases, we didn't have a culvert that we left in that basically wasn't feeding a drainage that had really truly had very little runoff in the first place. It hadn't moved from there was no evidence even around that culvert of dirt basically going through the culvert from the day it was put in there. So like I say, you destroy the culvert and the regen around the culvert crossing in order to do it, or do you leave the culvert and somebody's going to come 100 years and say, hey, there was a road here and there was a culvert here, and you know what I mean? And I guess when you weigh it out, from my opinion, it takes a lot. It's a lot harder to grow that tree than it is to deal with the fact that you didn't maybe get it back to its exact contour on the landscape. And like I say, there was a couple places we sloughed the road totally so that then the quads can't get in there and whichever. I guess the biggest issue in this country is ATVs and access created by motorized vehicles, and a large percentage of this corner of the world, the previous rangers that managed this corner of the world basically grew everything to grass because for the cows, right? Well, as the pressure came from other places, as we squeezed people out of Clearwater, for example, they came to this corner of the world, and they love it because everything's smooth, flat, nobody grass, nobody did put an ounce of rollback, there's very little drainage ditches. Like I say, you go 100 mile an hour down the cut line, so it's now started to draw these people in here, and now they're starting to destroy the place, and now the ranchers are all saying, geez, what are you going to do for me? And my response to them is, well, 40 years ago you should have shook your head and say, I want rollback and I want those things that are in the landscape, because they would have protected your interests way longer than what leaving them open has done, eh? But I guess 50-50, 100% hindsight looking at it from that context. But that's why I say the road here, like I say, this may or may not grow the appropriate vegetation at the end of the day, but it's going to grow some stuff, and it's going to keep the people basically onto the trail. And that's pretty much was the goal of this road, was to use it as a hardened off trail. At the end of the day, we did pretty much what we would have probably normally done, other than we would have probably made the whole roadway rough and lumpy. We contoured out I think we left in one culvert onto this site. I believe there's one culvert just up the road, and in one place they created a French drain here. And other than that, we pretty much left it from that context. You know what I mean? We took everything else out. We contoured the places that the fill has been, and as you can see, you know, I mean, it ties into that route that goes, that route you see that goes beyond was an old road that basically all they had done is seed it to grass and put some berms in it. You know what I mean? And up until now, it was pretty much an AT. You could drive your 4x4 back another couple kilometers back into the range. So now at least they have to operate on a ATV, and it's got them on a hardened off trail. So I consider this as a success, because now we don't have a lot of maintenance on this road. You know what I mean? If it rains, the quads can run on it, and they're probably not going to have, you may pool a little bit of water, but it's not going to do the damage that they've been doing off through the trees and whichever out in the open.
A couple things on the coarse woody debris. Where did you guys source the coarse woody debris, and were you guys targeting a certain percentage of ground cover on the surface of that site, or did you just eyeball it?
We eyeballed it, hey?
Yeah, the field crew basically.
We just kind of went. We got 2 logging contractors in the area, all working for West Fraser, and just whoever's closest. The other
Just
site
across
that
the
we're going
river
to
here, just across the river is where the woody debris came from those active cut blocks. Pretty much all Sunpine does is pile it and burn it. So they'll pretty much give it to you. You back up your truck and load it, and they'll load it for you and let you haul it away, so they don't have to burn it. So pretty much it's your hauling cost of the truck, your trucking cost or the cost. The woody debris is basically essentially no cost from that context.
Yeah, you just need more than you would think you would need.
Yeah.
Like I say, 95 loads on an end dump is a lot, but once you start spreading it around and breaking it up, and
I think that the future has to come is that we may end up having some woody debris piles around your well site for exactly that reality, to do the reclamation at the end of the day. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Same
it's all
thing as a
kept
strippings
now.
pile or whatever. We may have to start to look at these things that now there's going to be some log decks on that site, or not log decks, but woody debris piles contoured around that site in conjunction with the teardrop, and then you can come back. Like I say, if all you have to do is save your strippings and your woody debris for the teardrop, it's not really that significant amount of material to deal with. But if you're, in the past, we've been dealing with the whole square and not doing that interim reclamation, and that kind of defeats it. We've burned all the brush at the beginning of the time, and then we've had to come back and deal with it. Under the old criteria where you could grow grass, like I say, I've got, you can fertilize enough and seed grass to get the ranger to shake his head yes on for 15 minutes, and that's pretty well all you had to meet in the past. So the days of getting grass were pretty easy and simple, and we didn't really concentrate on what we were trying from a landscape, the equivalent land capability. So with the change in equivalent land capability now means you got to plan on day 1, not on day 69, like most of these sites have been dealt with from a reclamation standpoint. It makes it very hard to deal with sites like this that were built with the conjunction of just trying to grow grass at the end of the day. You know, I mean, the criteria changes, and I hate to say this, but the criteria is probably going to get tougher, not easier. You know what I mean? I think the days of easy grass growing are pretty much gone, and I think you're going to see more emphasis put on soils, woody, the vegetation, contouring, and those kind of things are just going to get tougher, not easier.
A question regarding weeds. I'm just kind of wondering what kind, like for specific to this area, what kind of expectation, like I know there's a lot of traffic with ATV and so on, so what kind of expectation for these sites in terms of controlling weeds like foxtail barley and Canada thistle? I've seen a little bit.
Well, I guess that is one of the problems, you know what I mean? I guess it's still their disposition until they get the rec cert, so it basically means that they need to manage the weeds accordingly till that point in time. The bigger difference here is that they're controlled to one trail and they're not all over the place. So you basically, you're going to have to monitor and deal with it. But what it does is at the end of the day, once they got the rec cert, that trail, that, you know, I mean, once they get sign off from me, when they go to apply for the rec cert, the trail is basically out of the process, you know what I mean? We don't encourage some places native seed because it doesn't take long before our good old forestry mix takes over and becomes the commanding species. And this is a very prime example of old forestry mix now invading this site, because that was what originally was planted to this site, was on this site because that was a requirement, the old forestry mix. And now you have to deal with it, but at the same time, you don't see a lot of weeds. You know what I mean? The site's vegetated, the weeds. It causes a little bit of struggle in this particular case. The reason that probably the seedlings aren't doing as well is because of the grass cover that's outraced the seedling. But where you do find the seedling, you know, I mean, he is growing and he's starting to establish himself, and it just takes a little bit longer, you know what I mean, from that context. This, like I say, the stuff in the interior here was stuff that was basically already on site that all Mark did is scoop up and move around. All they did is they moved it over, did their contouring and their cleanup, and then pulled it back. And, you know, I mean, those are already trees that were on the site. They're already acclimatized to the site, and you can see that, you know, we lost a few. You know what I mean? But at the same time, we took advantage of those trees that are that were already here and available. So at the end of the day, you know what I mean, this is another success from our point of view. You know what I mean?
Another thing that Kevin lets us do is, as far as our hoe can reach, we can pull in slash from the surrounding area.
The trouble with this particular site, there wasn't a lot of available slash to pull in because it was a cut block, you know, originally. You know what I mean? And most of the stuff on the other side hadn't started to blow down yet. So, you know what I mean? But we do, you know, lots of sites now, there's lots of blow down along the edges. If you can grab it without doing any additional damage to the surrounding, then you might as well pull it out and utilize it. It creates the microsite. That log creates a great microsite. You know what I mean? And that's perfect. You know what I mean? The shady side stays cool and whatever. If you watched on that other road where they had planted, where there's some seedlings, they look awful dry, but they're sitting in a pot that's shaded and there's a little bit of moisture hugging around that site. It'll last a lot longer than something that doesn't have that shade or that piece to create some the stuff to stay a little bit longer till it dries out. So, but like I say, this particular one, that's why you have all this grass. I'm not a real grass expert, so I'm not going to spell out the speaking. So, like I say, this site's coming. Like I say, it's got its rec cert and fully meets the, you know, it's put to basically back. If you talk about equivalent land capability, it's basically here and available. Yeah, great. It may not have the stems per acre. Well, that requires industry to start to push. It requires the timber industry to push to that requirement. They're slowly realizing that you put all these disturbances together on the landscape and they eat a big chunk of property off very quickly. But now with the interim reclamation and the push to go to equivalent land capability, I think they're more prepared to get on board because you're actually doing some site prep and it makes sense to plant those sites because you've done the work for them. All they have to do is come in and put the trees in the ground, and it's back to them having adding to their annual allowable cuttings. Yeah, as you can see here, Carol just pointed out those native the little seedlings. They're on these sites because they don't have competition with the grass. They're probably in the grass. You just got to hunt a little bit harder for them. But you know what I mean. This is the type of site that spruce cone basically thrives on. So. Good.
So was this certified to 2007 criteria or 2010? 2007, yeah.
This is, oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm just going to ask, this is public land, right?
Yeah.
How does the relationship with the ranchers work on this public land? Do they have grazing leases with?
Yeah, there's there are allotments, but pretty much the allotments are right out on the trunk road in this particular case. Generally speaking, they stick to where the grass is already there, which is along the roads. You know, these ones that are off,
pipeline right-of-ways.
Pipeline right-of-ways, which-ever.
And is there much? Go ahead.
Generally speaking, there's so much grass here that they don't spend a lot of time. You know what I mean? I guess you run into that problem more so on grazing leases than you do on open public crown land, you know what I mean? And especially if you got rough and lumpy, you know what I mean, they'll stick to where it's easier to walk than where it's rough and lumpy. That's where the rough and lumpy somewhat pays off. And at the same time, they don't, because of the rough and lumpy, they don't annihilate the area the same way, you know what I mean? Because they're not concentrated. They move to, they meander through rather than mow through, you might say, eh? But they traditionally stick to the easy pickings, which are the pipeline right-of-ways, road right-of-ways, places where it's easier to go. Unless somebody was to drive them down into here, but generally speaking, there isn't a lot of forced cow movement around here. So the way pretty much I've treated this is an older site, probably been on the landscape, I'm not sure what year.
68.
68. You know, I mean, this site was done under a totally different scenario and a ranger that basically worked under a totally different thing. I'm a believer that some of the history has to be taken into account of how that ranger decided on day one and the things that went around it, and now trying to smash it into the criteria. You know, it's no different than going to the 2010 criteria. There was lots of discussion or certain things dictated by that ranger that were to be done. Sometimes you can't go back and change those. You have to just try to work around them and get to it from that standpoint. Going forward in the way that the business is now being done, that everybody in EAP, where everybody understands the rules and regulations, you don't have that same dictatorial type thing from the ranger, you know what I mean? It's in the past, you pretty much did what the ranger wanted on that site that was created. So I'm a believer, like I say, that you come back and you have to look at the history of this site and say that ranger probably said smooth and grow grass on this site, and that met the requirement, you know what I mean? So at the end of the day, we haven't met the fully functional timber forest, but we've come a lot further than we would have if all we had done is left it smooth and seeded it to grass.
Kevin, you mentioned something at the other side about the debris this last time. And I know on the forestry side, we're not allowed to keep too much because of fire hazards. How is on the oil and gas side can we keep those debris and yet stay in compliance with what would be considered?
Well, I think we have to come up with methods to manage that. You know, the same thing we did with stripping piles and whichever. You know, maybe all of a sudden we bury that woody debris underneath the stripping pile. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So you still have access to that woody debris when you come back afterwards. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So there's all kinds of. I think even if in some cases we may have to put it closer where there's a mineral soil that's being maintained, such as around the teardrop or whatever, where somebody's maintaining that mineral soil around those brush piles from that context. Eh? Mm-hmm. I think the right now is that the world is changing so from this context that I think you got to start to look outside the box. I think people got to start to bring their ideas of this is what we want to accomplish. Here's some ideas of what we want to try to accomplish that. And I think that's where we now got to start to realize that we've always used fire hazard is burn it. You know what I mean? Well, yeah, that's great to solve the fire hazard problem, but it doesn't solve the reclamation at the end of the day. You know what I mean? So if you have to dig a hole and bury that woody debris and have a good map from that context, from that side of it, from that same as storing stripping piles. We used to bury stripping piles. Well, we all know that basically over time that basically become inert soil. You know what I mean? That you might as well left it up on top and seeded it to grass, and even if we're seeded it heavy and around the teardrop, and then you're going to come back at certain points and have to destroy a certain amount of that interim reclamation. You know what I mean? Even around a teardrop, you're probably going to have to destroy that 2 or 3 meters around that thing because it's storing the stripping soils, and you're going to need to re-strip it in order to move your soils around in order from the teardrop in order to then reclaim the contour of that site.
The other thing with rough and lumpy is in 2007, when we were done with it the following year, Mark, wherever you are, was one of the wettest years we had, and we had no erosion problems. When you do it like this, your water picks its way through, and all you're doing with this is we don't have to engineer anything. We don't need the big ugly erosion trenches and all of that, because the water will just pick its way around. We're going to get some small erosions, but as long as you don't let it run all the way across the lease, it's not going to turn into a big deal. It was the wettest year we had.
And settling doesn't become a problem because we're looking for the rough and lumpy. You know what I mean? It's not, you know what I mean? If you do this on, like we do, I encourage this a lot on a pipeline. Just do your reclamation in behind your pipeline construction. If it settles a little bit, you're never going to know. You know what I mean? From that context, and a little bit of settling on the right of way would basically adds to the rest of the concept that we were trying to do anyway. So you can do a lot of, if you do this work now, you can do it now pretty much at any time of the. You can do it in the winter operation, and you still accomplish the task when the equipment was already on site. You didn't have to haul it away and haul it back in the spring, because you can do it right there in the winter time, right from pretty much from the day you're done with that well site, from its construction point. You can now start interim reclamation.
Sure makes it harder to claw down these things, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. Well, the reality is that they're going to come. If they want to come, they're going to come. The objective, really, truly, of we've tried our damnedest from barriers to whatever, rocks, berms, trenches, pits. You know, we tried it all. But at the end of the day, it's discouragement.
Right.
It's getting them to go wherever they want. It's like I was just saying to one person on the other one, is that one actually has a trail that we can develop and stay with. But generally, we reclaim the whole road right away, and then let them pick that road. I don't try to tell you, let's build a quad trail through it. Reclaim it the way, just reclaim the whole thing the same way you would, and that first guy that goes down the right of way will set the track. And because you can never figure out where that first guy's going to go. Like I've done it where you basically had it smooth just like there, and he didn't pick that trail because it got a little bit of vegetation, or it didn't look, once some grass grew up on it, and he picked a different one, and everybody followed the different one. So, and generally then that one just started to erode and caused additional problems. So, like I say, now I just reclaim everything and let that first guy pick his trail, and generally everybody else will live after it. Large percentage of this kind of stuff here, though, is where they come in and dead end. That's the biggest problem, is you get somebody that quads in, the first guy quads in, realizes that this doesn't go anywhere, and he quads out, Well, then everybody that comes after it thinks that trail goes someplace. And you can actually see more damage on trails that basically go nowhere than basically the ones that actually go somewhere. It's amazing. Everybody drives in and beats the living crap going both ways to figure out this must go somewhere because it's a trail.
If you put up a sign, it would get driven
trying
over anyway, right?
Exactly.
You know, the sign, this trail goes nowhere.
So the object is kind of we kind of concentrate a little bit at the beginning to make sure it's a little more rougher and a little more lumpier, and it's a little more effort to deter that first guy going down the right of way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, this isn't much fun to quad.
Yeah.
You like rolling.
But the thing is this is access management. This is not closure. You know what I mean? Anybody can quad on this if they so choose to. You know what I mean? It's still open. I mean, the access is not blocked. It's still available, and you can do your business. We're not in the business of closing roads. We're in the business of doing access management in conjunction with reclamation. So.
I notice there's a lot of grass just in general in this country. Is that also seeded in at some point, or?
Yeah, you got to remember this site was seeded when it was in production. Was fully seeded to forestry mix. That's
even out in the cup.
And that's it's ingressed out into there. Yeah.
Do you guys know what the vintage of the site was?
68.
Oh, okay. So one can only imagine.
You have to look at 68 was pretty much. I'm pretty sure this is a 3-digit or 4-digit number on the disposition number.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's pretty much the one or two of the first 20 or 25 wells that were drilled.
Actually, I think it was 12,000 in that area.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
It's getting better.
12,000 basically started about 1966 is when the first dispositions were started to be issued. So, you know, what I mean, you can tell it's an old one and it's a moldy goldie, and it was on the landscape a long time before the work was even started here. And that's why I say every time they had an erosion problem on this site, they would have just leveled it smooth and poured the fertilizer and the grass seed to it. So there's probably so much grass buried into this dirt that's exactly what happened the minute that they rolled it over and sprinkled it. But that's part of the, as I said earlier, about kind of accepting the history of the past rangers and the past processes that were done. You have to respect the past to a certain extent on some of these sites, and the criteria isn't the be-all end-all. And I think that's where within the criteria there's a kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card, and that's basically the sign-off from the officer. You know what I mean? From the local ranger to basically be able to, hey, this is what happened on that site. This is what we want to try. It's different. It's unusual. And then get it signed off. And like I say, the big thing is making sure that you've got some documentation, because the ranger, in the past, you may have dealt with a ranger that was going to be on that site 20 years later. He may not, in this day and age, you're lucky to see the same guy 5 years down the road, you know what I mean? So I'm the last of the dinosaurs, you might say.